There's a door in Stranger Things that nobody talks about. Not a literal door. Not the gate to the upside down. Not the rainbow room or the isolation tank. This door exists in the mind of every viewer who's ever watched Eleven close her eyes, tilt her head, and make something bleed. And behind that door lives a truth so disturbing, so psychologically complex, so deeply woven into the fabric of who Eleven really is, that once you see it, you can never watch the show the same way again. Most people think they understand Eleven. They see the surface, the superpowers, the telekinesis, the nosebleeds, the shaved head, and the waffle obsession. They see the abused child who escaped a laboratory and found friendship, love, and a makeshift family. But that's not the whole story. That's not even half of it. What if I told you that Eleven's entire identity is built on a foundation of psychological fragmentation, so profound that every action she takes, every relationship she forms, every moment of heroism and every act of violence is colored by something most viewers never consciously recognize? What if the real tragedy of Eleven isn't what was done to her, but what she became because of it, and what she continues to be despite escaping? What if the girl we root for, the hero we celebrate, is simultaneously a victim and something far more complicated? Something we're uncomfortable admitting exists in a character we've learned to love. Here's what you need to understand right now, before we go any further. This video will not be comfortable. It will challenge everything you think you know about Stranger Things' most iconic character. It will force you to confront questions about identity, trauma, power, and the terrifying space between victim and survivor. Because Eleven's hidden truth isn't about supernatural abilities. It's about something far more human, far more broken, and far more real than anything the Upside Down could ever produce. This is about the girl who never learned who she was supposed to be because she was never given a chance. This is about a child raised as a weapon who must now pretend to be a person. This is about the psychological cost of power, the weight of expectations, and the unbearable burden of being simultaneously everything and nothing. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why Eleven's story is not just a tale of supernatural heroism, but one of the most devastating portraits of identity dissolution ever put on screen. So let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about it. Who is Eleven when she's not saving anyone? Who is she when the danger passes? Who is she when nobody needs her powers? Can you answer that? Can you describe her personality, her interests, her genuine desires separate from her trauma and her abilities? Most people can't. And that's not an accident. That's the hidden truth. We need to establish something fundamental before we dive into the depths of this analysis, something that will frame everything you're about to discover. Stranger Things is a show about nostalgia, friendship, and supernatural horror. But beneath that surface, beneath the Spielberg homages and the synthwave soundtrack, it's telling a much darker story about a girl who was never allowed to develop a self. Think about it. Really think about it. Every other character in Stranger Things has a personality independent of their trauma or their role in the story. Mike is passionate, stubborn, and loyal even when there's no crisis. Dustin is curious, scientific, and effortlessly charming. Lucas is pragmatic and protective. Max is fierce and guarded but playful. Will is sensitive and artistic. Jonathan is introspective and responsible. Nancy is driven and methodical. But Eleven? Eleven is defined entirely by what she can do and what was done to her. When you try to describe Eleven without referencing her powers, her past in the lab, or her relationships with others, you find yourself struggling. There's no stable core personality. There's no consistent self that exists independently of her circumstances. This isn't a criticism of the character or the writing. It's the point. Eleven represents something most viewers recognize instinctively but never articulate. The complete absence of self that occurs when a child is raised not as a person, but as a tool, an experiment, a weapon. And here's what makes this so psychologically complex, so emotionally devastating. Eleven doesn't just carry the trauma of her abuse. She carries the fundamental emptiness of never having been given the opportunity to become someone. Most people who survived childhood trauma still had moments of normalcy, glimpses of childhood, experiences that allowed them to develop preferences, interests, a personality. These fragments of self, however damaged, provide a foundation for recovery and growth. Eleven had none of that. From birth, she was Subject 11, a number, an experiment. Her earliest memories are of testing, punishment, isolation, and manipulation. She was never taught what it meant to be human. She was trained to be powerful. And when she escaped that laboratory, she didn't suddenly become a complete person. She became a frightened, traumatized child with godlike abilities, and absolutely no framework for understanding who she was or how to exist in the world. Everything she knows about being human, she's learned by observing others and mimicking what she sees. Her friendship behaviors are copied from Mike, Dustin, Lucas, and Will. Her understanding of romance comes from watching Mike and his expectations. Her concept of femininity comes from Max's intervention and the limited exposure she's had to other girls and women. She's not developing a genuine self. She's constructing a persona from borrowed parts, trying desperately to approximate what she thinks a normal girl should be. And beneath that constructed persona is a void that terrifies her more than the Upside Down ever could. This video will take you through 5 chapters, each one peeling back another layer of this hidden truth. We'll examine the psychological mechanisms at work in Eleven's character. We'll analyze specific moments from the show that reveal this emptiness. We'll explore what it means for her relationships, her heroism, and her future. But more than that, we'll confront an uncomfortable question that sits at the heart of Stranger Things, one the show itself seems afraid to fully address. Can someone who never learned to be a person truly become one? Or will they spend their entire life performing humanity while feeling fundamentally hollow inside? Very few people want to think about this. It's disturbing. It's sad. It forces us to recognize that escape from abuse isn't the same as recovery, that survival isn't the same as healing, that freedom isn't the same as wholeness. But if we're going to truly understand Eleven, if we're going to appreciate the depth of what this character represents, we have to be willing to look directly at this hidden truth. Because the tragedy of Eleven isn't just what Brenner did to her in that laboratory. It's what he took from her before she even knew it existed. The chance to discover who she might have been. Here's something that should disturb you more than it probably does. Eleven has never played. Not really. Not the way children play. Yes, you've seen her smile at Mike. You've seen her enjoy Eggos. You've seen her have fun with Max at the mall. But if you watch carefully, if you pay attention to the quality of these moments, you'll notice something unsettling. Eleven is always performing play rather than experiencing it. She's watching herself from the outside, consciously trying to do the things she thinks she's supposed to do, mimicking behavior she sees in others. There's a constant self-awareness, a studied quality to her interactions that reveals she's not simply being, she's trying to be. And this takes us back to the very beginning, to the origin of Eleven's psychological fragmentation. Her complete absence of childhood. Most people understand intellectually that Eleven was raised in a laboratory, subjected to experiments, and trained to develop her psychic abilities. But we don't fully internalize what that means for the development of a human psyche. Childhood is not just a period of time. It's the foundational phase during which human beings develop their sense of self, their understanding of boundaries, their emotional regulation, their capacity for genuine connection, and their basic personality structure. This development happens through play, through exploration, through safe attachment relationships, through the freedom to make choices, through exposure to varied experiences, through the gradual discovery of preferences and interests. Eleven had none of this. From the earliest age we see in flashbacks, her life consisted of a sterile room, a metal bed, clinical observation, psychological manipulation, and violent training designed to weaponize her abilities. She had no toys, no games, no other children to interact with freely, no loving caregiver providing consistent emotional support, no opportunities for unstructured exploration. She was subjected to a level of sensory deprivation and social isolation that would break most adults, and she experienced this during the exact developmental period when the brain is forming its most fundamental neural pathways for understanding self and other. Think about what this means neurologically, psychologically, emotionally. The sense of I that most people take for granted. The internal experience of being a continuous self with preferences, desires, aversions, interests, and a distinct personality develops through thousands of small interactions and experiences during childhood. A child learns they like sweet foods over bitter ones. They discover they prefer certain colors. They find certain textures comforting. They develop attachments to specific objects. They create imaginative games. They express themselves through drawing or movement or sound. Each of these tiny experiences contributes to the formation of a cohesive self-concept. I am a person who likes this, dislikes that, feels this way, wants that thing. 11 was systematically denied every single one of these developmental experiences. Instead, her entire childhood was organized around a single imperative: develop and control your powers. Everything else was irrelevant. Her preferences didn't matter because she wasn't allowed to have preferences. Her desires were irrelevant because she existed to serve Brenner's purposes. Her emotions were obstacles to be controlled, not legitimate experiences to be acknowledged and understood. She was taught to perceive her own consciousness not as the source of her identity, but as a tool to be manipulated in service of her abilities. And here's where this becomes truly disturbing. This didn't just prevent 11 from developing normally. It fundamentally altered the structure of her self-concept. In psychological terms, 11 never developed what's called a cohesive self. Most people have an internal sense of being one person, a unified consciousness with consistent characteristics that persist across different contexts. Yes, we behave differently in different situations, but there's an underlying me that remains stable. 11 doesn't have this. What she has instead is a collection of disconnected states, each one activated by different circumstances. There's the 11 who accesses her powers, cold, focused, distant, almost dissociated from her body. There's the 11 who tries to be a normal girl, uncertain, imitative, performing behavior she's observed but doesn't fully understand. There's the 11 who feels threatened, reactive, violent, lacking impulse control. There's the 11 who desperately wants connection, clingy, dependent, terrified of abandonment. These aren't just different moods or aspects of her personality. They're fundamentally disconnected states that don't integrate into a unified self. And this fragmentation shows up in ways most viewers don't consciously notice but intuitively feel. Watch the scene in Season 1 where 11 is at Mike's house, and the boys are trying to give her normal childhood experiences. Playing with toys, eating normal food, wearing normal clothes. There's a heartbreaking quality to these moments because you can see 11 trying desperately to understand what she's supposed to do, how she's supposed to feel. She doesn't organically engage with these experiences. She watches the boys' reactions and attempts to mirror appropriate responses. When Mike smiles at her, she tries to smile back. When Dustin laughs, she attempts laughter. But there's always a slight delay, a moment of processing before she can produce the expected behavior. This isn't shyness or social anxiety. This is a behavior of someone who lacks an internal template for spontaneous human interaction. Or consider the scenes with Max in Season 3, where Max is trying to help 11 develop independence and experience typical teenage girl activities. Shopping, trying on clothes, reading magazines, gossiping. These are all meant to be fun, liberating experiences. But watch 11's face carefully during these scenes. She's not experiencing joy or freedom. She's studying Max, learning the script, memorizing performance. She's figuring out what a normal girl does so she can replicate it convincingly. The show plays this for warmth and humor, and on one level, it is touching to see 11 attempting to have normal experiences. But underneath that surface is something much darker, a girl who's so disconnected from her own internal experience that she can only understand herself through external reflection. She doesn't know what she likes. She knows what Mike seems to want her to like. She knows what Max presents as desirable. She knows what gets positive responses from others. Her entire sense of self is built on external validation and observed behaviors because she never developed the internal foundation that would allow her to simply be herself. And here's what makes this even more psychologically complex. 11 is aware of this emptiness, at least on some level. She knows something is fundamentally wrong with her. She can sense that other people have something she lacks, an ease of being, a natural spontaneity, an ability to exist without constant conscious effort. This awareness manifests as a deep, pervasive shame that colors almost every interaction she has. When Mike tells her she's pretty, she doesn't simply feel pleased. She feels confused, uncertain, desperate to believe him, but fundamentally unable to integrate this information because she has no stable sense of self to attach it to. When Max tells her she doesn't need Mike, that she should focus on herself and her own desires. 11 can't follow this advice because she has no self to focus on. Without Mike, without someone to reflect her, she doesn't know who or what she is. When Hopper tries to set boundaries and give her structure, she reacts with extreme aggression because any limitation feels like an annihilation of the fragile persona she's desperately trying to maintain. These aren't just typical adolescent responses to well-meaning adult intervention. These are the reactions of someone whose sense of self is so unstable that any challenge to the external scaffolding she's constructed feels existentially threatening. And this brings us to perhaps the most disturbing realization about 11's condition. She can never truly relax. She can never simply be. For most people, there are moments of authentic presence, times when you're not performing or monitoring yourself, when you're simply existing in the flow of experience. Reading a book you love, listening to music, being with someone you trust, engaging in an activity that absorbs you completely. In these moments, the self-conscious I recedes and you're just present. 11 has never experienced this. She cannot experience this. Every moment of her existence requires active construction and maintenance. She must constantly monitor herself, assess whether she's performing correctly, adjust her behavior based on others' reactions, suppress the screaming emptiness inside her, and maintain the exhausting pretense that she's a real person rather than a collection of learned behaviors organized around supernatural abilities. This is a hidden truth that nobody talks about when they discuss 11's character. She's not just traumatized. She's not just recovering from abuse. She's fundamentally incomplete as a person, and she may never be able to develop the cohesive self that was destroyed before it could even form. The childhood she needed, the play, the exploration, the safe attachment, the freedom to discover herself, didn't just fail to happen. That window of development closed. The neural pathways that should have formed during those critical years either didn't develop or developed in profoundly abnormal ways. And now she's left trying to construct a self from the outside in, using borrowed materials, following instructions that don't quite make sense, attempting to be something she's never actually experienced. She's a performance of personhood with nothing at the center. And the most heartbreaking part? Everyone around her is so relieved that she escaped, so grateful that she survived, so focused on her heroism and her powers, that nobody notices a fundamental emptiness at her core. Nobody sees that the girl they saved never actually got the chance to become a girl at all. The most uncomfortable truth about 11's relationship with Mike is that she doesn't actually love him. She can't. Not in any meaningful sense. Not yet. I know that statement will make many fans defensive or angry. The Mike and 11 relationship is central to Stranger Things' emotional core. Their connection is meant to be pure, powerful, and redemptive. But if we're being honest, if we're willing to look at what's actually being portrayed rather than what we want to see, we have to confront a disturbing reality. What 11 feels for Mike isn't love. It's desperate, traumatized attachment to the first person who showed her basic human kindness. And the show knows this, even if it's not always willing to explicitly acknowledge it. Let's start with a fundamental psychological principle. Genuine love requires a stable sense of self. You cannot truly love another person if you don't have a cohesive you doing the loving. Love is not just intense feeling or attachment. It's a complex emotional experience that requires self-awareness, the ability to recognize the other person as a separate individual with their own needs and desires, and a capacity to choose connection from a place of internal security rather than desperate need. 11 has none of these prerequisites. What she has instead is what psychologists call trauma bonding, an intense attachment formed under conditions of fear, isolation, and survival. Mike was the first person to treat 11 as something other than an experiment or a monster. He gave her shelter, food, clothing, and protection. He told her she was pretty. He made her feel, for the first time in her life, like she might be a person rather than a thing. In the psychology of trauma, this creates an attachment so powerful, so overwhelming, that it becomes a traumatized person's entire emotional world. The caregiver or protector doesn't just become important. They become everything. They become the only source of safety, identity, and meaning. This is what 11 experiences with Mike, and it manifests in ways that are concerning if you know what to look for. First, there's the intensity and immediacy of her attachment. Within days of meeting Mike, 11 is completely devoted to him. She's willing to die for him. She's jealous of his other relationships. She's desperate for his constant attention and validation. Some viewers see this as romantic devotion, but psychologically, it's a massive red flag. Healthy love develops gradually as two people get to know each other, discover compatibility, and choose to build something together. Instant, all-consuming attachment is not love. It's a trauma response. 11 latches onto Mike with the desperate intensity of someone who's drowning, grabbing onto the first solid object they can find. He's not a person to her. Not really. He's a lifeline. He's proof that she might be human. He's the only thing standing between her and the terrifying emptiness of having no identity at all. Second, 11 has no capacity for healthy independence within the relationship. In a genuine love relationship, both people maintain their own identities, interests, and relationships while choosing to share their lives. They can be apart without falling apart. They support each other's individual growth. 11 cannot do this. When she and Mike are separated or when Mike tries to maintain other relationships or independent activities, 11 experiences what appears to be actual psychological disintegration. She becomes desperate, aggressive, or catatonic. She cannot conceive of herself as a person separate from Mike. This isn't love. This is pathological dependency. The show actually demonstrates this quite clearly in Season 3, though it frames it as typical teenage relationship drama. When Hopper manipulates Mike into spending less time with 11, and Mike, in his clumsy teenage way, tries to create some space, 11 completely unravels. She doesn't just feel sad or disappointed. Emotional responses that would be normal and healthy. She experiences something closer to existential crisis. Without Mike's constant presence and validation, she doesn't know who she is or how to function. Max tries to help by encouraging 11 toward independence, and the show portrays this as positive female empowerment. But watch what actually happens. 11 doesn't develop genuine autonomy. She simply transfers her desperate need for external validation from Mike to Max, mimicking Max's behaviors and opinions instead of developing her own. When Max tells her to dump Mike, 11 doesn't evaluate the relationship and make an autonomous decision based on her own needs and feelings. She does what Max tells her to do because she lacks the internal framework to make genuine decisions. She's still performing, still following instructions, still constructing her persona from external sources. And then, the moment Mike says what she wants to hear, she immediately abandons a tentative independence she was developing and returns to complete emotional dependency on him. This is not the behavior of someone who loves. This is the behavior of someone who needs. Third, and perhaps most telling, 11 has no genuine understanding of who Mike actually is as a person. She's attached to what he represents, safety, acceptance, normalcy, but she doesn't know him in any deep or meaningful way. Think about it. Can you identify specific things 11 appreciates about Mike's personality, interests, values, or character beyond he's nice to me? Does she understand his fears, his dreams, his struggles? Does she show curiosity about his inner life? Does she support his development as a person separate from his role in her life? No, she doesn't. Because to genuinely know and love another person, you need to have a stable self that can observe and appreciate otherness. 11 is so completely absorbed in her own desperate need for validation and identity that she cannot actually see Mike clearly. He exists in her mind not as a complete, complex human being, but as a projection of her desperate need to be human herself. And here's where this becomes even more psychologically disturbing. Mike, at some level, understands this and accepts it because it makes him feel important and needed. Mike is also a traumatized, insecure adolescent boy who feels powerless and insignificant in most areas of his life. Having 11 depend on him completely gives him a sense of purpose and importance he can't find anywhere else. He's not just her boyfriend. He's her savior, her protector, her only connection to humanity. This creates a deeply unhealthy dynamic where both people are using the relationship to fill voids in themselves rather than genuinely connecting with each other. The show hints at this dysfunction throughout seasons 2 and 3. Hopper can see it, which is why he tries to intervene. Max can sense it, which is why she pushes back against 11's total devotion to Mike. Even other characters seem vaguely uncomfortable with the intensity and dependency of their relationship, but because Mike and Eleven are positioned as the central romantic relationship of the series, and because their connection is meant to be pure and powerful. The show never fully confronts what's actually happening between them. What's actually happening is two traumatized children engaging in mutual dependency and calling it love. Now, here's what makes this even more complicated. I'm not saying Eleven's feelings aren't real or powerful. The attachment she feels to Mike is absolutely real. It's overwhelming, all-consuming, and genuinely central to her psychological functioning. But intensity isn't the same as health. Powerful feelings aren't the same as genuine love. And the tragedy here is that Eleven deserves actual love. She deserves a relationship built on mutual understanding, respect, and genuine connection between two whole people who choose each other from a place of security rather than desperate need. But she can't have that relationship with Mike, at least not yet, because she's not a whole person. She's a traumatized child with supernatural powers trying desperately to approximate normalcy by clinging to the first boy who was kind to her. And the show, by insisting on portraying this as romantic and beautiful rather than concerning and unhealthy, is actually doing a disservice to the depth and complexity of Eleven's character. Because here's the real question we should be asking. What would happen if Eleven actually developed a genuine sense of self? What would happen if she did the deep psychological work necessary to become a complete, autonomous person with her own identity separate from her trauma and her powers? Would she still choose Mike? Would she still need him the way she needs him now? Or would she discover that the relationship was never about him as a person? It was about her desperate need for someone, anyone, to make her feel human? This is the uncomfortable truth the show doesn't want to address. Eleven's relationship with Mike might be built entirely on a foundation of trauma and emptiness. And if she ever heals, if she ever becomes a complete person she deserves to be, she might discover that the boy she thought she loved was really just a life raft she grabbed while drowning. And that would mean everything she's built her identity around, her devotion to Mike, her role as his girlfriend, her sense of purpose in protecting him, might dissolve completely, leaving her once again facing the terrifying emptiness at her core. But there's an even darker possibility, one that explains why Eleven might subconsciously resist healing, resist developing autonomy, resist becoming a complete person. If she remains broken, she can blame her emptiness on her trauma. She can tell herself that if she could just escape her past, if she could just be normal, she would feel whole. But if she actually heals and discovers that the emptiness remains, that she's still fundamentally hollow even without the excuse of trauma, what then? This is the secret fear that drives Eleven's desperate attachment to Mike. He's not just proving she's human. He's protecting her from the possibility that she's not. There's a scene in Season 3 that most viewers interpret as a moment of triumph. But if you understand what's actually happening psychologically, it's one of the most disturbing scenes in the entire series. I'm talking about the Battle of Starcourt, specifically the moment when Eleven, powerless and vulnerable, faces down the Mind Flayer to save her friends. The show frames this as Eleven's most heroic moment. The point where she proves her worth isn't about her powers, but about her courage and her love for her friends. It's meant to be emotionally triumphant, a validation of her humanity. But watch that scene again, and pay attention not to what Eleven does, but to what's happening in her mind, on her face, in the quality of her presence. When Eleven loses her powers, she doesn't just lose her abilities. She loses the only coherent aspect of her identity. Throughout the series, Eleven's powers have been the one consistent part of who she is. They're the only thing about her that feels real, solid, undeniable. Everything else, her personality, her relationships, her understanding of herself, is performed, borrowed, constructed. But the powers? Those are authentically hers. When she uses her abilities, she's not mimicking or performing. She's accessing the only part of herself that actually exists. So when those powers disappear, Eleven doesn't just become vulnerable in a physical sense. She experiences something close to complete ego dissolution, the total collapse of the fragile identity structure she's been desperately maintaining. And you can see this if you watch carefully. In the scenes after she loses her powers, there's a quality of dissociation, of psychological disconnection, that goes beyond simple fear or sadness. Eleven is experiencing the psychological equivalent of falling through space with nothing to hold on to. Mike and the others interpret her distress as fear of the Mind Flayer, or sadness about losing her abilities. But what's actually happening is much more severe. 11 is confronting the fundamental emptiness at her core without the one thing that's been anchoring her to any sense of self. Without her powers, who is she? The show tries to answer this question by having 11 demonstrate bravery and loyalty. Look, it says, she's still a hero even without abilities. She's still devoted to her friends. She's still willing to sacrifice herself. But here's the disturbing truth that moment reveals. 11's willingness to sacrifice herself isn't evidence of selfless love. It's evidence of self-annihilation. When someone with a healthy, integrated sense of self chooses to risk their life for others, it's a genuine sacrifice. They're giving up something valuable, their own existence, their own future, their own possibilities, for the sake of people they love. But 11 doesn't experience it this way. She's not sacrificing herself. She's trying to prove she exists at all. Without her powers, without her role as protector and hero, 11 has no coherent identity. She's just an empty vessel going through the motions of being human. So the confrontation with the Mind Flayer isn't really about courage or heroism. It's about 11's desperate need to matter, to be significant, to have a purpose that validates her existence. She doesn't fear death because she's not entirely sure she's alive in any meaningful sense. This is the breaking point, the moment where everything we've been discussing crystallizes into something undeniable. 11's entire existence is organized around external purpose rather than internal being. She doesn't know how to simply exist. She only knows how to serve a function, to use her powers, to protect her friends, to be needed. And when that function is removed, when she loses her powers and she'll be forced to discover who she is underneath, the show reveals something terrifying. There might not be anything underneath. Let me be clear about what I'm saying, because this is the core of the hidden truth. 11 may not be a person in the way we typically understand personhood. She may be something we don't have adequate language to describe, a consciousness organized entirely around performance and reaction, without the internal coherence that we associate with a stable self. This explains so much about her behavior throughout the series, if you're willing to see it. It explains why she has no interests or hobbies beyond what others introduce her to. It explains why her emotional responses are often slightly off, slightly too intense, or slightly delayed, as if she's processing how she should feel rather than simply feeling. It explains why she forms such rapid, intense attachments, and why she becomes so profoundly disoriented when those attachments are disrupted. It explains why she's so susceptible to manipulation by anyone who offers her a clear identity or purpose, whether it's Brenner positioning her as his daughter, Mike positioning her as his girlfriend, or Hopper positioning her as his daughter. It explains why she can commit extreme violence with so little emotional aftermath. Not because she's cold or uncaring, but because her capacity for genuine emotional experience is fundamentally limited by her lack of integrated selfhood. And it explains the most disturbing pattern in her behavior, her apparent inability to learn and grow in meaningful ways. Think about it. Despite 3 seasons of experiences, relationships, and opportunity for development, has 11 actually changed in any fundamental way? Has she developed new interests, new capacities, new dimensions to her personality? No. She's still desperate for validation, still completely dependent on Mike, still defining herself through her relationships with others, still lacking any genuine autonomy or internal direction. She's not developing or maturing. She's just accumulating experiences without integrating them into a cohesive self. Other characters in the show grow and change. Mike matures and becomes more confident. Dustin develops romantic relationships and expands his interests. Lucas becomes more emotionally intelligent. Max processes her trauma and develops greater self-awareness. Will grapples with his identity and begins accepting himself. But 11? 11 remains fundamentally the same frightened, empty child she was in Season 1, just with more sophisticated coping mechanisms and a better understanding of how to perform normalcy. And this brings us to the most devastating realization, the true breaking point in understanding 11's character. The show wants us to believe that love, friendship, and acceptance can heal her. It wants us to believe that by giving her a family and a place in the world, Mike, Hopper, Joyce, and the others are fixing what Brenner broke. But what if they can't? What if the damage is too fundamental, too early, too pervasive? What if the window for developing a genuine self has already closed and no amount of love or acceptance or normalcy can create something that was prevented from forming in the first place? This is a hidden truth that nobody wants to confront. 11 may be permanently damaged in ways that cannot be healed. Not because she's not trying. Not because the people around her aren't loving her enough. But because the formation of a coherent self is a developmental process that happens during specific critical periods. And if it doesn't happen then, it might never happen at all. Brenner didn't just abuse 11. He didn't just traumatize her. He destroyed the possibility of her ever becoming a complete person. And now she's left with only two options: spend her entire life performing personhood while feeling perpetually hollow inside, or confront the unbearable truth that she might not be what she and everyone else desperately wants her to be. A girl who is hurt but can heal, a victim who can become a survivor, a broken person who can be made whole. What if she's none of those things? What if she's something we don't want to acknowledge exists? A consciousness that thinks and feels, but has no stable I at the center of those thoughts and feelings. This is the breaking point. This is the moment where we have to decide whether we're willing to see the full truth of what Stranger Things has created in 11's character, or whether we'll retreat into the comforting fiction that love and friendship can fix anything. Because here's what the show won't tell you, but I will. Some things can't be fixed. Some damage is permanent. Some people are so fundamentally broken that they can never be whole, no matter how much love surrounds them. And 11 might be one of those people. The girl everyone loves. The hero everyone celebrates. The character everyone roots for might be, at her core, a tragic example of what happens when a child is prevented from ever becoming a person at all. And if that's true, then every moment of her supposed happiness, every smile, every act of heroism, every declaration of love, is not evidence of healing, but evidence of performance so convincing that even she sometimes believes it. But late at night, when she's alone with her thoughts, when there's no one to perform for and no crisis to distract her, 11 confronts the same terrifying emptiness that's been there since the beginning. And she realizes that no matter how many people she saves, no matter how many friends she makes, no matter how much Mike says he loves her, that emptiness will never be filled because there was never anything there to fill in the first place. This is the hidden truth. This is the breaking point. And once you see it, you can never watch Stranger Things the same way again. Here's what nobody wants to admit. 11 doesn't just suffer from her emptiness. She makes everyone around her suffer too. Asterisk, asterisk, this is perhaps the most uncomfortable aspect of the hidden truth. The part that makes even those who follow this analysis so far want to turn away. We want to believe that 11 is purely a victim, that her trauma only hurts her, that her brokenness is contained within herself. But that's not how psychological damage works, especially damage as severe and fundamental as hers. Here's the part that makes this truth unbearable. Emptiness is not passive. A void doesn't just exist. It pulls. It distorts. It consumes. When someone lacks a stable sense of self, when their identity is hollow at the core, the people around them are unconsciously forced to compensate. They become anchors, mirrors, stabilizers, emotional life support systems. And that is exactly what happens with 11. Every major relationship in 11's life is quietly warped by the gravitational pull of her emptiness. Hopper doesn't just become a father figure. He becomes her containment unit, her emotional regulator, the wall holding back the flood. His overprotectiveness isn't just parental instinct. It's a subconscious recognition that if he loosens control, something catastrophic might spill out. This is why Hopper oscillates between tenderness and rage. He's not just afraid of losing 11 physically. He's terrified of losing the fragile structure holding her together. Every boundary he sets feels like a risk. Every argument feels like he might shatter her completely. And notice how Hopper's life shrinks around her. His identity becomes almost entirely defined by protecting 11. His grief for his biological daughter, his loneliness, his unresolved trauma, all of it gets folded into his role as 11's guardian. He sacrifices his own healing to stabilize someone who cannot stabilize herself. Joyce does something similar. She doesn't just care for 11. She absorbs her. Joyce, already a woman shaped by loss and anxiety, takes on the emotional weight of a child who cannot process her own inner world. Joyce becomes hypervigilant, self-neglecting, perpetually on edge, not only because of the supernatural threats, but because she's constantly managing someone whose emotional structure is fundamentally unstable. Mike, as we discussed, becomes something even more dangerous, a mirror. He is not allowed to be a flawed teenage boy with his own insecurities and confusion. He has to be constant, reassuring, devoted, emotionally available at all times. Any withdrawal, any uncertainty, any assertion of independence threatens Eleven's already fragile sense of existence. And when that happens, the emotional consequences are explosive. 11 doesn't respond to relational stress with sadness or reflection. She responds with collapse, rage, or dissociation. Because for her, relationships aren't connections. They are structural supports. Remove one, and the entire internal architecture starts to crumble. Even Max, who initially appears to offer 11 something healthier, eventually gets pulled into the same dynamic. She becomes a template, a script, a substitute identity. Max isn't helping 11 discover herself. She's unknowingly lending her own personality for 11 to temporarily inhabit. This is the invisible cost of loving someone without a self. You don't just love them, you hold them together. And holding someone together is exhausting. Over time, it breeds resentment, fear, guilt, and emotional burnout, even if no one consciously recognizes it. The people around 11 are slowly shaped by the constant pressure of being needed not just emotionally, but existentially. And here's the darkest part. 11 cannot see this happening, not because she doesn't care, but because caring requires a stable vantage point from which to see others clearly. She experiences people primarily in terms of how they affect her sense of safety and existence. Their inner worlds remain largely invisible to her. That's why she rarely asks questions about others' feelings unless prompted. That's why her empathy often feels delayed or muted. That's why violence comes so easily when she feels threatened. Because in those moments, the survival of her fragile identity eclipses everything else. This is not villainy. It's not cruelty. It's the inevitable consequence of a self that never fully formed. And this brings us to the final, most terrifying implication of all. If 11 remains fundamentally empty, every relationship she forms will eventually orb around that emptiness, until either the other person collapses under the weight, or 11 loses them and is forced to attach to someone new. This is not a path to healing. It's a cycle, and cycles like this don't break on their own, which leads us to the final chapter. Here is the true Stranger Things circles around but never dares to say out loud. 11's story is not about healing. It's about adaptation. She is not recovering. She is surviving. And those two things are not the same. Healing implies integration. It implies the slow construction of a coherent self, a stable identity that can hold pain, desire, memory, and meaning without collapsing. It implies growth that moves inward, not just outward. But everything we see from 11 moves in the opposite direction. She doesn't integrate. She compensates. She doesn't develop. She performs. Her powers return and vanish. Her relationships shift. Her environment changes. But the core pattern remains untouched. A consciousness without a center, desperately organizing itself around whatever provides structure in the moment. This is why the show repeatedly places her in situations where she must sacrifice herself. Because sacrifice gives her meaning. It gives her a reason to exist. It gives shape to the void. But meaning built on sacrifice is not identity. It's a razor disguised as purpose. And this raises the most devastating question of all. What happens when the story ends? When the upside down is closed? When the monsters are gone? When no one needs saving anymore? Who is 11 then? Not what can she do? Not who does she protect? Not who does she belong to? But who is she in silence? Because silence is where selves are revealed. And 11 has never been allowed to exist there. If Stranger Things were truly honest, truly brave, it would confront this possibility, that 11's arc cannot end with normalcy, romance, or quiet happiness, because those things require a self to inhabit them. And 11 may never have had one. Her true tragedy isn't that she was hurt. It's that she was shaped into something that looks human, feels human, suffers human pain, but was never allowed to be human in the way that matters most. She is not broken in a way that can simply be fixed. She is unfinished in a way that may be irreversible. And that doesn't make her less worthy of love. But it does mean love alone cannot save her. Conclusion: the story we tell ourselves so we can keep watching. We want to believe 11's story has a happy ending. We want to believe that friendship heals everything, that love fills every void, that trauma can always be undone if the right people show up at the right time. Stranger Things invites us to believe that, but the hidden truth beneath 11's character whispers something far more unsettling. Some wounds don't heal. Some losses can't be recovered. Some people survive without ever becoming whole. And maybe the most haunting thing about 11 isn't her powers or her pain or even her emptiness. Maybe it's the fact that she keeps going anyway, performing humanity, protecting others, smiling when she's supposed to smile, loving when she's told she should love, all while carrying a silence inside her that no monster could ever match. And once you see that, you don't just see 11 differently. You see Stranger Things differently. You see heroism differently. You see survival for what it really is. If this analysis changed the way you see 11, if it made you uncomfortable, if it forced you to question what healing really means, then tell me in the comments. Do you think 11 can ever truly become a whole person? Or is her story a tragedy disguised as hope? If you want deeper psychological breakdowns like this, stories that look past the surface and into the parts we're not supposed to talk about, subscribe to the channel. Because some doors were never meant to be opened, but once they are, you can't close them again.